And his wife actually is sort of Paul's counterpart at the cathedral. She does the adult faith formation there and does RCIA. So anyways, we're happy to have Deacon Brad with us, and maybe some point he can teach a class as well. So get to hear him in action. But he'll be preaching. The deacons will be preaching next weekend, so you'll probably hear him there. Right? Well, welcome. Several of you have been asking me about Father Matt Dalrymple, who's going to be replacing Father Peter as our parochial vicar. I spoke to him yesterday. He's recovering fine. I mean, it was a really bad accident. I mean, he was really banged up. So he's just been with his parents, actually recovering, and he's hoping to be back in the parish at St. Benedict's next week, which is where he is. And then, God willing, be here at the end of June here at St. Catherine's. So keep praying for him. Thanks.
Speaking of recovery, Julie, where are you? Julie Lugard, back with us. As you know, Julie's the mastermind when it comes to the breakfast on Sunday mornings, and had a challenging couple of weeks in the hospital. We are so glad
it was.
that you're back.
But y'all's prayers for after that here.
Just a couple of comments before we get started. First, we have an irregular situation with the handouts today. The printer copier at the office was kaput all week and still is as far as I know. What I finally did was decided that since the handouts you got last week included all the stuff they'll have till today, that I don't have new ones for you. But if you did not get one last week, I do have some that are left over. If you just raise your hand, Tom will hand them out there.
You weren't here last week.
Yeah, if you weren't here or you didn't get one last week.
The week before.
Nobody was here last week.
Oh, nobody was here last week. I'm having these senior moments more and more often, I tell you. So thank you. Yeah, 2 weeks before, if you weren't here. Wait a minute, they said we are here. Okay. It was 2 weeks ago. But anyway, it's Mother's Day or something. I don't know. What was it, Mother's Day? Memorial Day. Okay, we'll get it straight. All right, we got to have our joke for the day. Most of you are probably too young to remember W.C. Fields, the comedian. Okay, so you remember him anyway. He was not really a religious person, and toward the end of his life, this is a true story as far as I know, when he was suffering from the accumulated effects of a lifetime of drinking, which he was known for, and ill, W.C. Fields was discovered reading the Bible by one of his friends. The astonished friend asked, "What are you, an atheist, doing reading the Bible?" "Well," he said, "I'm looking for loopholes." All right. I need to mention as well that we have postponed, if you didn't get the email, we have postponed the trip to LaGrange to the fall. I'm sorry I've had to do it a second time, but there were so many people who couldn't come this time, we didn't even have enough to make a group to get a group discount, and the cost of the bus would have been prohibitive with fewer than 20 people for a bus that holds much more. So let's plan it for the fall. We'll try to plan a little further ahead of time, get everybody's money in pretty far ahead, all those things so that we can be secure and making sure it happens. But the more I look at it, they've added some things recently, the more I'm convinced it would be a great thing to do. So just stay tuned. Okay. All right. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord my God, bestow upon me an understanding that knows you, diligence in seeking you, wisdom in finding you, a way of life that is pleasing to you, perseverance that waits trustfully for you, and confidence that I shall embrace you at the last. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, we've been looking in the recent weeks at the monarchy, the kingdom of God's people. Ancient times, remember we went through the judges. After the time of the judges, the people cry out for a king. God says, "I am your king." People say, we still want a king, we want, I told you the story about the little boy, right, that one night his dad heard him crying and at bedtime, and he goes in and says, son, what's the matter? And he says, I'm scared. His father says, well, honey, you don't have to be scared, God is with you. And he says, I know, but I want somebody with some skin on it. So apparently the ancient Israelites wanted somebody with some skin, wanted a king with some skin on it. And God finally says, okay, and he's able to do that because he's always able to bring a greater good out of anything that happens, including all the stuff that he warned them was going to happen if they had a king, and did actually happen. We talked about Saul, the first of those kings, and how much trouble he got into and got the people into. We talked about David, who was a man after God's own heart, as the scripture says. And that's in many ways kind of a golden age, although David had plenty of flaws himself. We talked about the story about Bathsheba. And then we went on to begin talking about Solomon. We kind of ended with this slide, but I'd like to just go through this again quickly. Solomon was the son then of David by Bathsheba, ironically, since Bathsheba was the person he had committed adultery with and whose husband David had killed. And yet it's by Bathsheba that the great lineage of David's throne, his dynasty, which will eventually lead to the eternal dynasty of his descendant Jesus. This man, then Solomon, succeeds to the throne when David dies, and Bathsheba becomes the queen mother. And I don't think I mentioned this last week, but it's worth reviewing even if we have. It's very important to understand a little bit about the role of the queen mother in ancient Israel, because it helps us to understand the role of Our Lady as our queen. Some Christian traditions are critical of the Catholic tradition for speaking of Mary as a queen, and they say, oh, well, that would mean that she'd have to be Jesus' wife. That doesn't work. But this notion of husband and wife as king and queen is not the universal notion of king and queen. As we know even from the British Empire and their history, that often you have the queen mother, who is the mother of the king. And in the time of David and Solomon, as we'll see, the kings tended to have multiple wives. So how are you going to choose which wife is going to be the one to be your queen if that's the way it's set up? And occasionally it would be that way. So Jezebel was a wife rather than a mother, or a wife rather than a mother, and she was queen. But for the most part, the usual thing was that the mother would be the queen because the king had only one mother. So no disputes then about who has that position. Whereas, can you imagine having several hundred wives getting into an argument over who's going to be queen? Would have been terrible. It'd be hard enough to remember their birthdays, though. Bathsheba is the queen mother. Let me just read to you a quick passage that gives you an idea of her role, not just her role, but her status within the kingdom. So to kind of summarize, someone comes to, I'm not going to go into all the details, but comes to Bathsheba and asks her to intercede with the king on his behalf. So that tells us something right there. And we read later on that happens often. But this person actually says to her, the king will not refuse you. The king will not refuse you. So Bathsheba, queen mother, went to King Solomon to speak to him on behalf of this person. And when she comes into his audience, now it's a common thing, and was up until recently, maybe it is still in some places, that when a person entered the room who was someone to be revered or honored, that everybody else stood up. And that even if you were all in a room together, when the king or the person to be revered stood up, everybody had to stand. That's really the story behind why when the Hallelujah chorus is sung, everybody stands up. Are you familiar with that, the background to that? The first time that Handel's Messiah was performed, one of the King Georges, there was an audience with him, and he may have even commissioned it, I'm not sure, but he was so moved when the Hallelujah chorus started that the king rose to his feet. And immediately everybody had to rise to their feet, because that's what you did when the king stood up. You didn't sit in the king's presence. And so a similar thing kind of goes on, we see, not just in this passage, but in others, that when Solomon entered the room, the king, everyone would stand up. They all sit down. When the queen mother enters the room, the king stands up. It's pretty amazing. And so Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him on behalf of her. And the king rose to meet her and bowed down to her. Then he sat on his throne and had a seat brought for the king's mother, and she sat on his right. And we've talked about this before. What is the right? The right hand of the person on the throne is the place of honor, right? Of highest honor. Then she says, I love it, it's just like the way a mother would say it to her adult son. I have one small request to make of you. Do not refuse me. So, pretty amazing. So that gives us an idea of why the Israelites would have called her Gabir, the Great Lady. That was her title, the Great Lady. And it helps us to understand why when we talk of Our Lady, Mary, we would say that she is the queen. Not because she's Jesus' wife, but because she's the queen mother. She's the mother of the king. And part of her role is to act as an intercessor. We come to her with our request to him. And he shows her great honor. And that's why when we picture her in heaven, I mean, obviously it's kind of our poetic way of picturing things, but we see her at the right hand of the King, of King Jesus. And if he is king of the universe, that makes her queen. He's king of angels, she's queen of angels. And beautiful, powerful thing to think about, that's her role. So just wanted to mention that when the angel Gabriel, I may have said this in here before, when the angel Gabriel goes to Mary at the Annunciation and tells her what's about to happen. You remember one of the things he says is that this son that you will bear is the Son of the Most High, and he will reign on the throne of his father, meaning forefather, David. Implicitly, he is telling her, and you are the Queen Mother. That makes her the Queen Mother. If he's going to be the king, she's the Queen Mother. So it's right there implicit in that passage, though he doesn't have to come right out and say, you're the queen. Anybody who knew that situation would understand it. So, just a little bit about Bathsheba then. So we mentioned last week that Solomon consolidates his power. Because he does have people kind of jockeying for power and for the throne. He develops extensive trade with other lands, with Lebanon, with Egypt. He has a trade route developed all the way to Arabia, what's now Yemen. He's getting gold, he's getting spices, he's getting incense, all kinds of things. He strengthens relationships with neighboring countries through treaties, which got him into trouble actually, because in those days, what was the way you typically strengthened or made an alliance with another country? You married into their family, right? Or you had, so he would take a wife from all these neighboring pagan countries. And he organizes the new empire of Israel along Egyptian lines, kind of imitating the way Egypt has done things. He's able to avoid major war, and he enjoys a long period of peace throughout his reign. So his reign is known as Israel's glorious age. Some more stuff in the handouts that you can take a look at. But so Solomon came to be, we'll go on to the next slide and then we'll talk a little bit about what the rabbis have to say about Solomon. His wisdom is legendary. He, according to scripture, let me just read that passage. God told him he could ask for anything, and here's how he answered. Pretty amazing. This is in 1 Kings 3:5. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give you. In other words, ask me, I'll give it to you. And Solomon said, you have shown great and merciful love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and merciful love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. So, and now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David, my father, although I am but a little child. According to legend, he was only a teenager. I do not know how to go out or come in. It's a great statement of humility. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, here's his request, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? And it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no king shall compare with you all your days. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Beautiful, isn't it? He could have asked for anything, and he asked for wisdom. So his wisdom is legendary. The quality was most needed a good ruler, so of course God was glad to give it to him. Many of the wise sayings in the book of Proverbs are attributed to him. The story, well, I should go ahead and do that too, read that too. This is great stuff. An example of his wisdom and judgment, and you probably have heard the story before, but if not, just listen, it's great. It reminds me of in the New Testament where the woman caught in adultery is brought before Jesus. And, they pose the question, okay, so, you're gonna stone her to death? This is what the law requires, and they think they've got him trapped. And instead he comes up with this brilliant way of solving the situation. So here, again, 1 Kings 3:16. Then two harlots came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I was delivered, this woman also gave birth. And we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She rolled over in the bed and suffocated the child. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and as while I slept, and laid it in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, it was dead. But when I looked at it closely in the morning, behold, it was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, no, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, no, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. Before I go on, how many know the rest of the story? Okay, most of you. Yeah. Then the king said, the one says, this is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other says, no, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Which, of course, that's horrible. But then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means slay it. But the other said, it shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it. Then the king answered and said, give the living child to the first woman, and by no means slay it. She is its mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to render justice. Wow, what a story. Isn't that great? So, I just want to mention, sometimes it's kind of fun just to look at the rabbinical commentaries, the commentaries of the rabbis. Yes?
You remember that reminds me of that story of Susanna where they questioned the two old
Yes.
men. What creed was she under, or something? It was a terrible, no, it was a, he said,
And he catches them in a lie. Yes.
Daniel, yeah.
And to this day, you want to interview witnesses separately, right? That's a great wisdom. I love it. So I like to go sometimes in the Old Testament to the commentaries of the Jewish rabbis, their long tradition. Because as you can imagine, they have thought very deeply about these stories and things. But in addition to that, they often have developed certain kind of fanciful legends that go along that at least give you a sense of how that character has figured in Jewish culture, history, legend. And so I just wanted to mention a few of the things that some of the rabbis had to say about Solomon, that this notion that he was so great and so wise and filled with knowledge began to take on a life of its own. And eventually it was claimed that he was acquainted with everything in that day that was known regarding all living things, so trees, fruits, flowers, beasts, fishes, birds. He didn't write a lot. He may have left several Psalms, and we know that, and a portion of the book of Proverbs. And probably his life formed the basis of the book of Ecclesiastes, maybe even some elements of the Song of Songs. But they have this notion that he just kind of knew everything. He just knew everything. And there was an old saying that he who sees Solomon in a dream can hope for wisdom. That would be assigned to you if you dreamed about Solomon, that God was going to give you wisdom. He's said to have understood the languages of the beasts and the birds, to have had no need of relying on witnesses and delivering a judgment. So the legend was that all he had to do was look at the contending parties and he knew immediately who was right and who was wrong. There's a legend that when he was about to build a temple, he applied to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, for builders and architects. And Pharaoh, which could have actually been historically correct, but he says that Pharaoh, sneaky old Pharaoh, ordered his astrologers to choose for his laborers that he would send all the men who were going to die in the current year anyway. So he's going to send all the guys that are going to die. And he sends these to Solomon. But Solomon, simply by looking at them, according to the legend, knew what their fate was to be. So his response was he provided them with coffins and shrouds and then sent them back to Egypt with a letter to the Pharaoh informing him that he was in need of Pharaoh was in need of articles required for the dead. It wasn't necessary for him to send men. All he had to do was ask for the materials he needed. So it's a great rabbinical story. It's the kind of thing you come to expect. According to their legends, his realm extended before he fell with his wife, morally, over the whole upper world inhabited by the angels, and over the whole of the terrestrial globe with all its inhabitants, including the beasts and the fowls and the reptiles, and that he also ruled over the demons and spirits. And that his reign was so glorious that the moon during his reign never decreased, and good prevailed over evil. And because he was able to control demons and spirits and animals, he could have the demons bring him precious stones from hidden secret places under the earth, and water from distant countries to irrigate his exotic plants. Beasts and fowls of their own accord, I love this, that he had such control of the animals and they loved him so much that the animals that he wanted to have for dinner would on their own accord come into his kitchen and present themselves to be slaughtered for dinner. According to one extensive legend, he was accustomed to ride through the air in a large eagle, which brought him one day to a place in the wilderness. And he would fly all over with this eagle. And then he had a carpet, they said. That sounds like maybe an Arabian influence, I don't know. A carpet that was 60 miles long and 60 miles wide, made of all kinds of stuff, ornamented, and surrounded by 4 princes, animals, and he was caught up by the wind and he would sail through the air, that he could have breakfast in Damascus and supper in Media, which is over there near Iran. So then the temple, of course, we're going to talk about that in just a second, was in many ways kind of the major, at least architectural achievement, certainly, of Solomon. And according to these legends then, he was assisted by angels and demons in building the temple. And the edifice was actually miraculously constructed. The heavy stones would rise and settle in their respective places all by themselves at his command. And the general opinions of the rabbis is that Solomon cut out the stones by means of something called shamir. That was a worm whose mere touch would make a rock split in half. And so that's how the rocks were split. So in his prophetic capacity, the legend says that he realized the temple would years later be destroyed by the Babylonians. So he caused an underground receptacle to be built in which the ark was hidden afterward. And to this day, there's some folks who think that it's likely, I'm not one of them, but it's likely that that's where the ark is actually hidden. Why is it that we can't do archaeological excavations on the temple site today.
Over the rock.
Because the rock, a very sacred place to the Muslim faith now occupies that place. And it would be disaster politically and every other way if anyone tried to do an archaeological expedition underneath their excavation. So that brings us to the temple. Now I'm just reading, those were legends. I just want you to hear that, just kind of for the entertainment value, but also to help you get a notion of how important Solomon became in Jewish tradition. And so, and even in the time of Jesus, when Jesus would say something like, Queen of Sheba came, and that's a historical piece from the Old Testament. Queen of Sheba came all this distance to hear Solomon, and you people who are not listening to me, you've got someone greater than Solomon here. He's talking about himself. What that would have meant to them, not just you're better than the big king, but you've got someone who is even more wise and knowledgeable than this legendary figure.
Is it possible that the rabbis' legends were known in the time of Christ?
At least some of them.
So that-
I mean, it's hard to know how far some of these go back,
That
but
would have been a significant, thing, a wiser than Solomon was here.
yes, right. And that's the point I'm making. Yeah, that for him to compare himself and say, I'm even wiser and smarter than Solomon, should have made a big point to him. And even when he talks about consider the lilies of the field, they don't sow or spin or reap, but even Solomon in all his glory didn't compare to them. So according to God's plan, Solomon built the temple, the first temple of Jerusalem. There's so much we could say about this, and when you go back to your handouts, you'll see you have some stuff about the furnishings there in it. And in a minute, if I can get this thing to work okay, it'll be the first time I've done it, I'm going to go to a YouTube clip that kind of shows you the dimensions of the temple. What's the significance of this? Well, we already read how God had said to David, you're going to or there will be a temple built, but you won't be the one to do it. Your son will be the one to do it. And before this time, we have to remember that the worship of the Israelites was decentralized. That from early times on, a father in many ways acted as priest for his family. Would have sacrifices. You could have an altar. You had priests in various places. Even though you had the tabernacle, and that was with the Ark of the Covenant, and that was very important, there was no permanent architectural structure where the tabernacle with the Ark of the Covenant would reside. The tabernacle actually means a tent, it's something mobile. And so God's ultimate plan then was that once they were in the nation, in Canaan, they were established, the nation was established. Once, as we mentioned last week, David had conquered the Jebusite city and made it his capital, which we call Jerusalem. Then it was time, things were prepared for God to have this centralized place of worship. And once the temple was built according to God's instructions, first of all, it had to be built on a particular place, Mount Zion, there in Jerusalem. But second, once it was built, then sacrifices were not to be offered anywhere else. You could worship God, of course, and as we'll see later, when the temple is destroyed and the city of Jerusalem is destroyed and the people are put into exile, they don't have a temple anymore. They formed a system of synagogues of people assembling to pray and to worship and to read the scripture and study it. Synagogue just means an assembly. But they couldn't perform sacrifices anymore, because the only place, once the temple was built, where sacrifice could be performed was that place. That's why to this day now, with the temple not constructed, Jewish people don't have sacrifices. They have instead the word. So God commands that sacrifices, as I said, should only be made in this place. So then Jerusalem takes on a great significance, not just as the political capital of the nation, but also as the spiritual capital of the nation. Let me see what time it is. 9:30. You know how I am I probably need some prayer warriors to cover me while I do this now. You know how digital stuff does with me. I'm going to try to put it on a YouTube thing, so give me a second, and we'll see if it works. That means I have to. Okay. Any questions while we're doing this?
No, concentrate on what you're doing.
Good point, Mary.
Wouldn't it seem like the rabbis, that would be a little bit pagan, all these different ideas they had about Solomon, the animals and all this kind of thing? I mean, that's almost like the Jebusites or something with Moloch and all the other stuff. Nature worship.
I mean, there were so many rabbis, and just like with the church, they often, in any given place, they would be affected by, influenced by the culture around them. And so, it's not surprising that you might have something that sounds a little bit like the Arabian Nights.
Crowd pleasers or something.
I mean, they would have always said all this, any power that's here goes back to God in him, any gifts that he had, anything that he has is a gift from God. It's not like he had in himself some kind of magical power.
And that would be the pagan idea there.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Is this gonna work? Yeah. Yes. Okay, your prayers are working? Let's see what happens.
Cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits. And the porch before the temple of the house, 20 cubits was the length thereof, according to the breadth of the house, and 10 cubits was the breadth thereof before the house.
The text is just from the Bible.
And for the house he made windows of narrow lights. And against the wall of the house he built chambers round about, 5 cubits high, and they rested on the house with timber of cedar. The nethermost chamber was 5 cubits broad, and the middle was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad. For without in the wall of the house he made narrowed rests round about, that the beams should not be fastened in the walls of the house. The door for the middle chamber was in the right side of the house, and they went up with winding stairs into the middle chamber, and out of the middle into the third. And the house, that is, the temple before it, was 40 cubits long. And the oracle in the...
Come on. I guess it's...
forepart was 20 cubits in length, and 20 cubits in breadth, and 20 cubits in the height thereof. And within the oracle he made 2 cherubims of olive tree,
Cherubim
each
is
10
the plural,
cubits
by the way.
high.
It's not cherubim.
And he set the cherubims within the inner house, and they stretched forth the wings of the cherubims, so that the wing of the one touched the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub touched the other wall, and their wings touched one another in the midst of the house. And he carved all the walls of the house round about with carved figures of cherubims, and palm trees, and open flowers, within and without. And the whole house he overlaid with gold, until he had finished all the house. And for the entering of the oracle he made doors of olive tree. The lintel and side posts were a 5th part of the wall. So also made he for the door of the temple posts of olive tree, a 4th part of the wall. And the 2 doors were of fir tree. The 2 leaves of the one door were folding, and the 2 leaves of the other door were folding. And he carved thereon cherubims and palm trees and open flowers, and covered them with gold fitted upon the carved work. And Solomon made all the vessels that pertained unto the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, and the table of gold, whereupon the showbread was. And the candlesticks of pure gold, 5 on the right side, and 5 on the left, before the oracle, with the flowers and the lamps, and the tongs of gold. And he set up the pillars in the porch of the temple. And he set up the right pillar, and called the name thereof Jachin. And he set up the left pillar, and called the name thereof Boaz. And upon the top of the pillars was lily work. So was the work of the pillars finished. And he made a molten sea, 10 cubits from the one brim to the other. It was round all about, and his height was 5 cubits, and a line of 30 cubits did compass it round about. It stood upon 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, and 3 looking toward the west, and 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east. And the sea was set above upon them, and all their hinder parts were inward. And it was an handbreadth thick, and the brim thereof was wrought like the brim of a cup, with flowers of lilies. It contained 2,000 baths. And he made 10 bases of brass. 4 cubits was the length of one base, and 4 cubits the breadth thereof, and 3 cubits the height of it. And on the borders that were between the ledges were lions, oxen, and cherubims. And every base had 4 brazen wheels, and the work of the wheels was like the work of a chariot wheel. Then made he 10 lavers of brass. One laver contained 40 baths, and upon every one of the 10 bases 1 laver. And he put 5 bases on the right side of the house, and 5 on the left side of the house. And he set the sea on the right side of the house eastward, over against the south. So was ended all the work that King Solomon made for the house of the Lord.
It worked. Okay, let me just do this real quick, and I'm sure there are all kinds of questions.
What is a cubit?
I knew that was coming. Okay. Cubit is a measure of.
Yeah.
All right, who's asking that? I know you're probably talking about Bill Cosby's old.
No, that was you.
Okay. A cubit is about 18 inches. It's from here to here. Yeah. So it depends, of course, on the person, which is why we finally had to standardize something because it's not standard. How many of you remember? Unfortunately, Bill Cosby, but he used to be really funny. Years ago, when I was a kid, he actually had a comedy routine called Noah's Ark.
Oh, yeah.
How many of you ever heard Bill Cosby? Remember the Lord was like, "Oh, I want you to build an ark that's blah 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 cubits by so and so cubits." Right. What's a cubit? What's an ark? So anyway, this is just interesting. It's the most interesting, or the best I could find of kind of giving you an overview of the temple, but it is produced by the Mormons. And that's why they had some suggested things up there to read Mormon stuff. Don't know why the guy would say cherubims. Cherub is the singular, cherubim in Hebrew is the plural. So you don't have cherubims, you have cherubim or a cherub.
What is, he refers to the oracle? What's the oracle?
I don't remember where he said that.
Holy.
Oh, that's what they were using for it. Yeah, okay, I guess that maybe they're in translation, but that would be the place. The Holy of Holies was the place where you went to hear from God, for the priest, where God would speak. And so probably, yeah, it sounds like what you can say, and that would have been also called an oracle then, which is the general word you use for a place where the gods speak. What other things? Oh, yes, great.
I've never heard the pillars called names.
Yeah.
Boaz and, I didn't hear the other.
And Jake, or something like that.
Who is that?
Well, I mean, I don't know for sure. Boaz, of course, was Ruth's husband,
Yeah.
so maybe it's kind of honoring an ancestor. But I need to go back and look at. I'm hoping that's not something the kind of Mormons slipped in. Maybe they did.
Did they give a time frame on the project there? Or did they?
Oh, 7 years, I think, for the temple, and another like 14 or something for his palace. He also built a big, beautiful palace. But of course, if you've got the Shamir worms, cutting the stones and they're going to their place, right? It didn't have to take so long. Yes.
Some of those vessels, I mean, they mentioned like the measurement was only like 3 cubits, so there they appeared huge and imposing, but some of them, like those little bath things, the 5 on each side, I think they said the height of those was 3 cubits, so that's, if I heard correctly, that's not real huge.
They probably should have put some human figures in the thing to help you, kind of see the proportions, the scale.
Is that the thing that had the oxen around it? Is that supposed to be where the lambs were sacrificed?
No, that's for the ritual bath, for the priest to be cleansed.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So the lambs are sacrificed on the altar. Yeah.
Is there, you said it was cherubim and that some other type of angel carved?
We don't know. I mean, it's just the tradition is that they were the kind of covering angels, that they were the ones who were near God, and I guess that probably comes in part from passages like the beginning of Ezekiel, where you have the seraphim, and I think the cherubim are there too. If not, I'd have to look. Maybe Deacon does, but you know, we get fanciful kind of descriptions of them. They can take on any form they want. But one reason.
In the design of the ark, which, so this is probably connecting back to the design of the ark.
Yes. And we actually have parallels in some of the pagan temples and religious sites of the time where they would have, you know, some kind of preternatural figure, perhaps being being angelic or like that, with its wings covering over a special place. So there may have been some influence. I mean, it's okay. We can have influence from other cultures. We have some churches that have, you know, look like the old Greek temples. Yes.
Just to ease everyone's mind, I think what he was saying was directly from 2 Chronicles 3 and 4, because it does say that he set up pillars, and one to the south he called Jacob, and the other Boaz. It's okay.
It's okay. It's not some occult thing. It's added in there. Okay, the questions about that? How's our time?
It's quarter up.
Oh, okay. All right. That will just give you an idea that, so you've got that outer area, and then you've got the holy kind of sanctuary area where the priests will work, and then you've got the Holy of Holies, the most the inner portion place where you would have the Ark of the Covenant kept. And later on, when we're looking in the New Testament, which is obviously going to be next year now, we'll see that the temple that Herod built, that kind of, because this temple got destroyed, but not maybe completely, but that he built was even more elaborate than this one. So we'll look more deeply into the details of that. So yes, ma'am.
What was the three-story on the side? What was that used for?
I think those, if I'm not mistaken, those were like storage rooms, because they had to have all kinds of things for the sacrifices and other stuff.
Did they have a place for the priest that was on duty at the time to live?
To live? That's a good question. I'm not aware of it, but they may have been. I mean, we don't know everything about it, too. Is the other thing. This is a long time ago. This is long before Jesus' time, and it was a different temple. So,
I
yes.
imagine they would have had these probably, just imagining they would have had these elaborate like tapestries and cloths and linen things and stuff like that in there, wouldn't they have? You think?
Probably. They certainly had that with the tabernacle when it was, because it had to be mobile and it was cloth. But most of the description seems to say the things are like gold leafed and then carved in there. Cherubims, the palm trees, the other thing. Another thing just to say in passing about this is that keep in mind that, you know, sometimes the Catholic tradition is criticized for having religious images, representational art, and that's the criticism kind of uses as its proof text the commandment that says you will not make any graven images. Well, the problem with, you know, that interpretation is, number one, it doesn't just say don't make graven images. It says don't make graven images. What's the rest of the sentence? In order to worship them. Yeah. Number two, just a few chapters later in Exodus, you have God commanding the people to make graven images to be used in worship, not to be worshipped, but to be used in religious rites of pomegranates and all kinds of other things, angels. And so this was kind of a continuation of that tradition that we had in the tabernacle. So it's very clear that unless God is contradicting himself, he didn't say don't create images as part of sacred art. He was saying just don't worship his idols.
I was thinking the other day, when John Paul II got shot, he had the statue of Our Lady brought to the Vatican, you know, so that the original statue that was made by the sculptor there, so that he could have it there with him.
He also had the bullet. He used the bullet to make an ornament for a statue.
Oh, are there any remnants of that particular?
Of the temple?
Yeah.
Well, we've got the temple site. It's hard to, again, because Herod's temple would have been built on top of it. Almost certainly, if they could find remains of it, it would be underneath there, but they can't get to it. What they have found is that where the Muslim authorities of the Temple Mount did some kind of excavation of their own and were throwing out all this stuff. And so some of the Jews came and said, well, let's take a look at what they're throwing out. And sure enough, there were all these pieces that could very easily have been from this earlier period being used being used in ceremonial rites and for living. But we don't know for sure because it's covered under that and they can't do excavations. I wish they could. It's interesting to find. So, yes, ma'am.
Sorry, one more question. So the western wall that we see the Jews going on to, that's part of Herod's?
It'll be Herod's, yeah.
Okay.
Although some people try to dispute that, but I don't think it can. That's me. So, the wisest man that ever lived, huh? Except he has some unwise policies that contribute to his downfall in many ways. Despite his great wisdom, Solomon eventually becomes a tyrant, politically a tyrant, with a luxurious lifestyle. He has 300 wives and 1,000 concubines. Or as one kid wrote on a religious studies essay in college one time, 300 wives and 1,000 porcupines. I should read to you sometime. Have you ever seen a book called Anguished English by Richard Lederer? Oh my gosh. His is mostly high school, some of it's college, and he has bloopers from student papers and also from, that's how it started, student papers. He's an English teacher, and then also from newspapers and from headlines and all kinds of things. And somebody, he includes it in a part of the history of the world according to student bloopers. That somebody thought he had 1,000 porcupines. So, I'll bring that in sometime because it's great. It's got these classic lines like, and so God commanded the people to make unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is bread without any ingredients. So, this practice of having all the foreign wives violated the law of Moses against intermarriage with pagan peoples. But worse yet, in order to kind of satisfy these wives, they did not, for the most part, convert and become Jewish kind of converts, but instead they kept their pagan practices, and in order to indulge them, he would build shrines and temples for their pagan gods, and sometimes he would even take part in performing the rites, which is a great way to invite demonic activity into your life. He also taxed the citizens heavily to support his vast bureaucracy. He used forced labor to build his great construction projects. He transferred certain rights and privileges of the tribes to the person of the king. So, we always have to keep in mind, these guys are human beings after all. So he certainly has problems. And so, near the end of his reign, troubles break out everywhere. There's several revolts of conquered peoples, and eventually there's a rebellion among the Israelites themselves, civil war. Solomon dies, and the kingdom actually divides into two nations then. So, Israel is the northern kingdom, representing the lands of the 10 tribes to the north. And Judah, and this is all in the handout that you got earlier, represents the 2 tribes of the south, Judah and Benjamin, and it includes the territory around Jerusalem. So from here on out, no longer a united monarchy, a united kingdom, but a divided monarchy, a divided kingdom with 2 sets of kings. So each nation, the northern one's called Israel, the southern one's called Judah, has its own line of kings. Some were good, but many were evil. During the divided kingdom era, each nation had 19 kings that we have recorded. Kings of the north, Israel, came from 9 different dynasties. It's a very unstable kind of political situation where the different families are fighting and taking control, and then somebody overthrows them and starts a different dynasty. But the kings of the south were all descended from David, so at least there was some stability there. Some of the queens, such as Jezebel, who's pictured here, an old mosaic, I think, also wielded considerable power. We won't go into the stories of Jezebel, but she was quite a character. Oh my goodness. To this day, when people talk about she's a Jezebel, it means a manipulating, controlling figure, especially in politics. Sometimes the 2 kingdoms were allied, but often they were hostile, and their divided forces weakened them, and they're fighting against each other, and made them vulnerable to conquest by foreign powers. And that's exactly what happened. So we will talk then next week about how they got invaded, multiple invasions, separately conquered, and exile taken out of there, and how that then sets things up for the next stage in salvation history. Other questions? Yes, Barb?
When is the custom of just marrying one wife?
Somebody asked that the other day, and I tried researching it. I didn't get any good answer. Deacon, do you know? Because I think by the time of Jesus, Herod was still having multiple wives, you know. My guess is for the monarchy, if you're talking about the monarchy, probably not until it was totally dissolved by the Romans, and you know, then it just never kind of reconstituted. It was never reconstituted. For everyday people, I would think probably certainly by the time of Jesus, that was becoming more the norm. But that's my speculation. I don't know. If anybody can find out, let me know.
Could be women started getting smarter.
They said the men couldn't remember their birthdays. So other questions? All right. Just a reminder, we meet next week, and then what? Only one more week after that, right? Next week will be Father's Day, so I know some of you might be out, right? Is next week Father's Day?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. But then keep in mind that we will not meet for the month of July, and I just found out yesterday that the PSR isn't meeting till like the third weekend or something in August, so we may not start back till then. We may make our break a little bit longer, but if so, I'll let you know before we're done. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.